He didn't
He
do
didn't
it.
do it!
The voice cracked through the courtroom like a struck bell, high and clear and utterly unafraid, and every head turned at once. For a moment, nobody moved. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keys. The bailiff near the door took one uncertain step forward and then stopped, as if his body couldn't decide whether an 8-year-old girl standing in the center aisle counted as a threat. The judge's gavel, already rising for the next order of business, hung suspended in the air. Maya Johnson stood with her small chin lifted and her arms spread wide, as though she meant to physically shield the man sitting alone at the defense table from whatever the room was about to do to him. Her braids were still damp from the rain outside. Her sneakers didn't quite reach the floor when she'd been sitting, which was why no one had noticed her slip out of the gallery bench until she was already halfway down the aisle. Behind the defense table, Kang Min-jae, the man the tabloids had taken to calling the Cold King, the man half of Seoul believed had sold his own country's secrets for a fortune he didn't even need, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks without real sleep, found the little girl standing between him and the entire weight of the Korean judicial system. He did not know her name. Across the room, seated beside her lawyer, with her hands folded in practiced serenity, Seo Ji-hee allowed the corner of her mouth to lift. Just slightly, just enough that only someone looking directly at her would catch it. The judge set down his gavel without striking it. "Whose child is this?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the particular sharpness of a man whose courtroom had just been interrupted for the first time in a long career. "Bailiff, please remove. I know who framed him." The words landed, and the room went silent in a different way than before. Not startled silence, but the silence of people suddenly, involuntarily listening. The judge leaned forward. "Young lady, this is a court of law. You cannot simply—" "He's innocent," Maya said again, louder this time, and something in the plainness of it, the total absence of doubt, seemed to steal the air out of the room. "I know who framed him." Nobody in that courtroom had an answer for that. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, already halfway out of his chair to object. Not Seo Ji-hee, whose smile had gone very still. Not Han Woo-jin, standing near the back wall in his tailored suit, who had gone the color of old paper. And then, before the judge could finish forming his next sentence, before the bailiff could close the distance to the girl, the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom began to open. Slowly, deliberately, a woman stepped through them, backlit by the corridor lights, her silhouette straightening as she crossed the threshold into the room, a folder held against her chest like something precious. Nobody in that room yet understood who she was, or what she was carrying, or how a coffee shop owner and her daughter had ended up at the center of the biggest scandal in Korean corporate history. If you've ever been the only person in the room who believed someone else was telling the truth, drop a comment, "I know that feeling," in the comments below. And if you want to know exactly how an 8-year-old ended up defending a billionaire nobody else would stand up for, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to take you all the way back to where it started. 3 weeks earlier, the bell above the door of Rachel's cup rang at exactly 7:14 a.m., which was the moment Maya Johnson decided the day could officially begin. "Good morning, Mr. Park," she announced to the elderly man shuffling in for his usual black coffee. No sugar, extra suspicious of anyone who tried to talk to him before 9. "Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts? If you had 3 hearts, would you get 3 heart attacks, or just one really big one?" Mr. Park, who had been coming to this shop every morning for 2 years and had never once smiled before his first sip, paused at the counter. "That is a very strange question for so early." "I think about strange things early," Maya said, entirely serious. "My brain doesn't know it's supposed to wait until later." Behind the counter, Rachel Johnson bit back a laugh as she pulled the espresso shot, not looking up from the machine. "Maya, let the man order his coffee before you give him an existential crisis." "I'm just saying, if I had 3 hearts, I'd want extra recess. That seems fair." "Extremely fair," Mr. Park said, and for the first time in 2 years, he actually smiled before his coffee touched his lips. He left a tip in the jar on his way out, which he had never done before either. Rachel watched him go, then looked at her daughter, who was now carefully rearranging the pastry case so that, in her words, "the muffins can see out the window too." 8 years old, and already the shop's best customer relations department. Unpaid, unbothered, unstoppable. "You're going to talk somebody into a stroke one of these days," Rachel said. But there was no real warning in it. There never was. Maya's mouth ran 12 steps ahead of everyone else's patience. But it was never cruel. It found the soft, funny, true thing in a moment and said it out loud before anyone else had worked up the nerve. "I'm going to be a lawyer," Maya said, apropos of nothing, climbing onto the stool behind the counter with her sketchbook. "Lawyers talk for a living, so really, I'm just practicing." Something in Rachel's chest pulled tight, the way it always did when Maya said that word, lawyer. Rachel hadn't set foot in a courtroom in almost 3 years. Not since the day a man named Marcus Webb had smiled at her across a defense table in Atlanta, right before the evidence against her client mysteriously multiplied overnight. Evidence that later turned out to have been planted by the very man Rachel had spent 8 months trying to convict. By the time the truth came out, Rachel's name had already been dragged through every legal blog and bar association newsletter in the state. Evidence tampering. The words followed her the way smoke follows fire, even after the flames are out. Nobody cared that she'd been exonerated. They only remembered the headline, "Never the retraction." No firm would touch her after that. Not in Georgia. Not anywhere in the States, not really. Reputations traveled faster than the truth ever could. So she had packed 2 suitcases, held her 4-year-old's hand at the airport, and started over in a country where nobody knew her name, in a language she was still learning, behind the counter of a coffee shop she'd bought with the last of her savings. She told herself it was enough. Most days, she almost believed it. "You'd be an amazing lawyer," Rachel said, instead of any of that, wiping down the counter. "But right now, you're an amazing 8-year-old who has school in 30 minutes, so eat your toast." Maya groaned, the groan of the deeply persecuted, and slid off the stool, but not before adding, "Mommy, when I'm a lawyer, I'm going to defend you, so you don't have to worry anymore." Rachel's hands stilled on the counter for just a second too long. "I'm not worried, baby," she said. Maya, 8 years old and entirely too observant for her own good, looked at her mother with the particular clarity children have before the world teaches them to look away from things that hurt. You do the Bill face at night, when you think I'm asleep. The Bill face? The one where your eyebrows go like this. Maya scrunched her whole face into a knot that was, unfortunately, an extremely accurate impression. Rachel laughed despite herself, because the alternative was crying, and she didn't have time to cry before the morning rush. Eat your toast, genius. But she thought about it all morning, between orders, how her daughter noticed everything, how nothing in this world seemed to slip past her, not the ache underneath a joke, not the tired lines around her mother's eyes, not the months where the register came up short, and Rachel quietly skipped her own lunch, so there'd be enough for both their dinners. Maya saw all of it. She simply chose, every single day, to fight it with laughter instead of fear. It was a gift, Rachel thought. She only hoped the world would be gentle enough to let her daughter keep it. Across the city, in a glass tower that scraped the low gray clouds, Kang Min-jae stood at his office window, with his tie already loosened at 9 in the morning, watching Seoul move beneath him, like something he was no longer entirely a part of. The tabloids had a name for him. Several, actually. The Cold King, the ghost of Kang Enterprises. The man who'd inherited his father's empire, an empire that, in its earliest years, had not been built entirely on legitimate ground, and had spent a decade quietly, painstakingly dismantling every criminal thread his father had woven into it, replacing shadow deals with shipping contracts, replacing debts owed to dangerous men with actual, defensible revenue. It had taken him 10 years. It had cost him nearly everything else. Nobody printed that part of the story. It didn't sell papers the way Mafia Air did. "You have a 9:30 with the board," his assistant, Yuna, said from the doorway, holding a tablet like a shield. "And Mr. Han would like 10 minutes before that, if you have them. Tell him he can have 5. Han Woo-jin had been Min-jae's closest friend since they were both 9 years old, catching frogs in the drainage ditch behind their grandmother's apartment building, long before either of them had ever heard the words shareholder or acquisition. When Min-jae's father died and left him an empire built on rot, Woo-jin was the only person who hadn't flinched. He'd rolled up his sleeves and helped Min-jae bury the worst of it, brick by brick, favor by favor, until what remained was something almost clean. Min-jae trusted him the way you trust your own hands. That morning, Woo-jin came in smiling, the way he always did, clapping Min-jae once on the shoulder. "You look terrible. I always look terrible before board meetings. It's my process. You should eat something that isn't coffee. You sound like Ji-hye." Something flickered across Woo-jin's face at the mention of her name, so brief that another man might have missed it entirely. But Min-jae had known Woo-jin for 30 years, and he filed the flicker away without quite knowing why. "How is the wedding planning?" Woo-jin asked, too smoothly. Slow. "She wants everything perfect. I told her, I don't care about the flowers, as long as it's over by 9, so I can go to bed." Woo-jin laughed, and it sounded almost normal. Almost. Romantic as ever. "I didn't fall in love with romance," Min-jae said, and there was something quieter underneath it, something he rarely let show. "I fell in love with someone who didn't want anything from me except me." That was rare enough. He didn't see the way Woo-jin's jaw tightened at that, or the way his old friend's eyes moved, just briefly, to the closed door of the office, as if checking, out of long habit, that no one else was listening. 2 blocks from Rachel's Cup, in an office building far less glamorous than Kang Enterprises Tower, an employee named Sun Ho Kim received a phone call that would have changed his life if it had gone any other way. His mother needed emergency surgery, the kind that cost more than Sun Ho made in 2 years. He'd already begun drafting the resignation letter, planning to sell what little he had, when an anonymous transfer appeared in his mother's hospital account, enough to cover everything, with a note attached that read only, "Get well soon. No need to thank anyone." Sun Ho never found out it was Min Jae. Nobody ever did. That was, deliberately, the point. It was a small thing in the grand architecture of a billion-dollar company. It would never appear on any balance sheet, never be mentioned in any profile, never make it into the whispered rumors that painted Min Jae as cold and untouchable. But it was who he actually was, underneath the reputation his father had left him to inherit, a man who had learned, the hard way, that power meant nothing if you didn't spend some of it making the world softer for people who couldn't do it for themselves. He never told anyone, not even Woo Jin, especially not Woo Jin, though he couldn't have said exactly why that particular secret felt like it needed protecting. There was one more thing about Min Jae that nobody printed either, because it was the kind of detail too small and too human to make a headline. 3 nights a week, no matter how late the board meetings ran, he called his late father's old housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. O, 71 years old, retired now, living alone since her husband passed, just to ask if she'd eaten dinner. She was the only person left who had known him before he became the Cold King. She still called him young master and scolded him for skipping meals, and he let her because it was the only place left in his life where nobody wanted anything from him except for him to take care of himself. He was, underneath every rumor stacked on top of him, a deeply lonely man who had simply gotten very good at not showing it. That loneliness was about to meet its match in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his tower, though neither of them knew it yet. It became a pattern before anyone realized it was one. Every Tuesday and every Friday, at almost exactly 4 in the afternoon, a man in an expensive gray coat and a woman with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper wardrobe took the corner table at Rachel's Cup, the one tucked behind the bookshelf, half hidden from the counter, the one regulars had started calling the quiet table because whoever sat there never wanted to be disturbed. Rachel noticed them the way she noticed everyone, pleasant, professional, careful not to hover. They never ordered much, 2 coffees, occasionally a pastry neither of them touched. They spoke in low voices and always stopped talking the moment anyone came near. Maya noticed something different. Maya noticed that they never once looked at each other while they were talking. She noticed that the woman's foot tapped whenever she got upset, a quick nervous rhythm against the table leg, and that the man's hands went very still whenever the woman raised her voice even slightly. She noticed, because she was 8 and bored and doing her homework at the little table nearby, that they used a lot of words that didn't make sense together, hearing and transfer and belong to us, words that sounded like something from a courtroom drama, except said by 2 people who were clearly not lawyers. She didn't understand any of it. But Maya Johnson had a mind like flypaper. Everything stuck. She simply filed it away, The way she filed away octopus facts and the names of all 50 state capitals, without any sense yet of what any of it would eventually mean. After the hearing, "It won't matter what he thinks he can prove," the woman said one Friday, low, urgent. "He trusts us too much," the man muttered back. "That's always been the problem. He doesn't check anything anymore, not since. Keep your voice down. Everything will belong to us," the woman said, quieter now, almost to herself, almost like a woman convincing herself of something she still didn't quite believe she deserved. All of it. Maya, 7 feet away, colored in a picture of a dinosaur wearing sunglasses and hummed a song from school, and did not understand a single word of what she'd just heard. She would not understand it for 3 more weeks. The morning the news broke, Rachel had the television on low behind the counter, the way she always did, more for background noise than anything else. She was steaming milk when the anchor's voice sharpened in that particular way that meant something big. Kang Min-jae, CEO of Kang Enterprises, has been formally arrested this morning on charges related to the leak of classified technology connected to the national infrastructure project known as Solomon's Gate. Sources say the evidence against him is, quote, "overwhelming and largely undisputed. Financial records, security footage, and digital communications reportedly trace the leak directly back to the pitcher of milk overflowed." Rachel didn't notice for a full 3 seconds. "Mommy, it's spilling," Maya said from the counter, not even looking up from her sketchbook. And then she did look up, because the man's photo had just filled the screen, a photo Maya recognized instantly, not from any tabloid, but from something else entirely. Her whole body went still. "That's him," she said. Rachel wiped up the milk with a rag, distracted. "That's who, baby?" "That's the man from the corner table, the Tuesday-Friday man." Maya's eyes were wide now, fixed on the screen, on the mugshot-style photo of a face that looked nothing like the composed, quietly stricken man she'd glimpsed briefly, once, when he'd stopped by the shop himself weeks ago to pick something up before a meeting. The actual Kang Min-jae, not the man who'd been sitting at the corner table, pretending to be his friend and speaking about him in low, careful voices. Rachel frowned. "Sweetheart, that's Kang Min-jae. He's not the man who comes in on Tuesdays." "No, Mommy, listen." Maya slid off the stool, urgent now, in a way that made Rachel actually put down the rag. "The lady at the corner table, and the man with the gray coat. They talk about him. They said his name, sometimes. They said he trusts us too much. They said after the hearing. They said..." Maya's face scrunched with effort, reaching back through weeks of half-understood, overheard fragments. "They said everything's going to belong to them." Rachel felt something cold slide down the back of her neck, the old, familiar, unwelcome feeling of a lawyer's instinct waking up after a long sleep. She pushed it down immediately. "Baby, I think you might be putting together things that don't actually connect. Adults talk about lots of things. It doesn't mean..." "I'm not making it up," Maya said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't a child's stubbornness. It was closer to hurt. "I remember it. I remember all of it. You always tell me that innocent people deserve someone who believes them. That's what you tell me. Every time." Rachel's mouth opened, and nothing came out for a moment. She had said that. More times than she could count, usually while explaining to Maya Why she'd left her old job. Why they'd moved across the world. Why some good people got hurt anyway, even when they'd done nothing wrong. She had said it to comfort her daughter and to comfort herself, and she had never once expected her own words to be handed back to her, at 7 in the morning, over spilled milk, by an 8-year-old who had apparently been paying far closer attention than Rachel ever gave her credit for. She crouched down to Maya's eye level, hands on her daughter's small shoulders. "Tell me again," she said quietly. "Everything you remember, slowly." Maya, sensing finally that she was being taken seriously, took a breath and did exactly that. The words, the corner, the tapping foot, the way the man's voice always dropped when he said Minjae's name, all of it, in the careful, proud recitation of a child who has just realized, for the first time, that the things she notices might actually matter to someone. It took 3 days for Rachel to admit to herself what she was actually doing. She told herself she was only humoring Maya, that she'd look into it for an evening, find nothing, and gently explain to her daughter that sometimes grown-ups' conversations sound scarier out of context than they actually are. That would be the end of it. Instead, she found herself pulling up the shop's old security footage on her laptop after closing, Maya asleep in the back room on the little cot Rachel kept for slow afternoons, and scrolling through weeks of grainy, silent video, looking for a corner table half hidden behind a bookshelf. She found them. Tuesday, Friday, Tuesday, Friday. A rhythm too consistent to be coincidence, stretching back nearly 2 months. The footage was useless as evidence, no audio, and the angle only ever caught the backs of their heads, the woman's dark, sleek hair, and the man's gray coat, never a clear shot of either face. But the pattern itself was undeniable. Someone had been meeting here, twice a week, with enough consistency that it had to matter. The receipts confirmed the dates. At least, the shop's old point-of-sale system logged every order with a timestamp, and cross-referencing them against the footage gave Rachel a clean, verified timeline of every single visit. 2 coffees, same order nearly every time, same table. It proved nothing. A timeline of 2 people drinking coffee wasn't a conspiracy. It was just 2 people drinking coffee. But Rachel had spent 8 years as a defense attorney before her life fell apart, and she knew, the way you know a smell before you can name it, that patterns meant something. Nobody met in the same hidden corner of the same coffee shop, twice a week, for 2 months, to talk about the weather. She stayed up until 2 in the morning, cross-referencing the dates against public news. Kang Enterprises' quarterly earnings calls, board meeting announcements, the formal opening of the government's Solomon's Gate infrastructure bidding process. She built a spreadsheet, old habits reawakening faster than she expected, her fingers remembering rhythms she thought she'd let go of forever, mapping every Tuesday and Friday meeting against whatever had been happening publicly at Kang Enterprises that week. A pattern began to surface. Not proof. Not yet. But a shape. The way a shape appears in fog before you can say for certain what it is. 3 days after Maya's overheard fragments had knocked over Rachel's careful, quiet life, Rachel sat at her kitchen table at 1 in the morning and admitted the truth to herself. She was investigating again. She hadn't touched a legal pad in 3 years, and here she was, filling one with a stranger's timeline, chasing a case nobody had asked her to take, for a man she had never even properly met. She told herself it was for Maya, that her daughter needed to see that the things she noticed mattered, that paying attention to the world was never wasted. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth, and some quiet, buried part of Rachel knew it. Somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the fear of being dragged back into a system that had already tried to destroy her once, something in her recognized the shape of an innocent man being crushed by evidence too perfect to be real, because she had lived inside that exact nightmare herself, 3 years and 1 ocean ago, and nobody had come to save her. She wasn't going to let that happen to someone else, not if there was anything at all she could do about it. Rachel started investigating the way she used to before her life fell apart, methodically, quietly, refusing to let herself believe anything until it could survive being doubted. The coffee shop's security footage gave her a timeline, but no faces. The receipts gave her dates, but no names. What she needed was something that could connect the shape she was seeing to an actual identity, and for 4 more days, nothing came. She watched the footage so many times she started dreaming about it. The same corner table, the same 2 backs, the woman's hair always sleek and dark, the man's coat always gray, always that particular unhurried gray that expensive coats have. She compared it against every photograph Kang Enterprises had ever released publicly. Board members, executives, nothing matched cleanly enough to be certain. Meanwhile, Min Jae was fighting his own losing battle 2 blocks away, though Rachel didn't know it yet. He'd spent those same 4 days going through every name he could think of, with the 2 lawyers who still returned his calls, trying to find a single thread that made sense of evidence that was, on its face, airtight. His own security badge logs, his own digital signature, transaction records that led back to accounts only he was supposed to have access to. Every lead his team chased ended at a wall. Whoever had built this had built it to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny Min Jae's people were throwing at it. By the 4th night, one of his lawyers had quietly stopped returning calls altogether. Min Jae understood what that meant. People believed what the evidence told them to believe, even when the person the evidence was hurting had spent 10 years trying to be someone worth believing in. He sat alone in his apartment that night, untouched dinner going cold on the table, and thought, absurdly, he knew, uselessly, of a small coffee shop and a little girl who'd told him his tie looked like it was having a bad day. He didn't know why that memory kept surfacing. Maybe because it was the last time anyone had looked at him and seen a person instead of a headline. Rachel found her break by accident, the way real breaks often come, not through brilliance, but through her daughter flipping idly through a magazine while waiting for the shop to close. "Mommy?" Maya held the magazine up, tapping a glossy photo with her small finger. "That's her hair. That's exactly her hair." Rachel took the magazine. It was a society page, spread from months earlier. Kang Min Jae and fiancé Seo Ji-hye at the Chungmu Charity Gala, and there she was, sharp cheekbones, sleek dark hair, the same elegant coat visible in 3 of the corner table security frames Rachel had studied so many times she could have drawn the shape of it from memory. Rachel's stomach dropped somewhere it hadn't dropped in years. "Maya," she said carefully, "are you completely sure?" "I'm sure, Maya said. "She has a mole here." She touched her own jaw, just below her ear. "The lady at the corner table has it too." "I noticed, because it looked like a little chocolate chip. Rachel zoomed into the security footage that night until the image blurred into pixels, but she found it. A small dark mark just below the jawline on the woman who had sat in the corner of her shop 40 times over 2 months, plotting. She was now almost entirely certain against the very man she was supposedly going to marry. Rachel sat very still for a long moment after that, the laptop's glow the only light in the apartment, her daughter asleep down the hall, and thought about the sheer, staggering cruelty of it. A man everyone believed was a criminal, arrested on evidence Rachel now suspected had been manufactured by his own fiancée. A man with no one left to trust. She thought about Marcus Webb's smile across a defense table in Atlanta, years and an ocean away, and how nobody had believed her either. Innocent people deserve someone who believes them. She had taught her daughter to say that. Now it was time to actually mean it. The man was harder, weeks harder. Rachel had a face now, but no name. The woman's identity had cracked the case open only far enough to reveal a second, deeper mystery. If Seo Ji-hye was involved, who was the man in the gray coat, and why did he sit close enough to matter, but never once show his face to the camera? She started pulling every public record she could access about Kang Enterprises' leadership. Board minutes, executive bios, anything with a photo attached, cross-referenced against the build of the man in the footage. His height, roughly, the particular way he held his shoulders, the gray coat that reappeared in his wardrobe, with enough consistency to suggest habit rather than coincidence. It was Han Woo-jin's official corporate biography photo, pulled from the Kang Enterprises investor relations page at nearly midnight on a Thursday, that finally matched. Han Woo-jin, Chief Operating Officer, childhood friend and longtime confidant of CEO Kang Min-jae. Rachel read the line 3 times before it fully landed. Childhood friend, not a rival, not a disgruntled employee with something to gain from Min-jae's downfall in any obvious, transactional way. A man who had, by every public account, spent 30 years standing beside Kang Min-jae through everything. His father's death, the company's painful transformation, every hard year of rebuilding. Rachel sat back from her laptop, feeling something heavy settle into her chest. She thought of her own old partner at the firm, the one who'd vouched for her character, right up until the moment it became inconvenient to keep doing so. Betrayal from a stranger was a wound. Betrayal from someone who had earned the right to be trusted first was something closer to an amputation. She pulled up every financial disclosure she could find, connecting Han Woo-jin's name to anything unusual. Shell companies, consulting fees, anything. It took hours, most of it dead ends, records too vague or too buried in corporate jargon to prove anything on their own. But slowly, painstakingly, a shape began to form. A small consulting firm registered 18 months earlier, its ownership structure deliberately opaque, its only visible client a shipping subcontractor that buried 3 layers deep in public filings, turned out to have handled logistics for the Solomon's Gate infrastructure project. It wasn't proof. Rachel knew, with the clear, cold clarity of 8 years of legal training, that none of this, the coffee shop meetings, the mole on a jawline, a vague consulting firm, would survive 30 seconds of cross-examination in an actual courtroom. A good prosecutor would tear it apart before she finished her first sentence. She had motive now. She had 2 names. She had a pattern stretching back 2 months. She did not have enough. She tried, anyway, to find a way to make it enough. She spent 2 full nights reading through every article ever published about Han Woo-jin, searching for some public thread that might tie him more directly to the leak itself. She found interviews from years earlier, back when Woo-jin was still spoken of warmly in the business press as the quiet half of Kang Enterprises' success, a man credited with the operational discipline that let Min Jae's vision actually function. She found a profile piece where he'd said, when asked about his friendship with Min Jae, that he owed him everything and would never forget it. Reading that now, knowing what she suspected, made Rachel's stomach turn. She thought about calling the prosecutor's office directly. She drafted the email 3 separate times and deleted it 3 separate times because she knew, from bitter experience, exactly how these things worked. A former lawyer with a tampering scandal on her record, calling in from a coffee shop with theories about a mole and a company name. No prosecutor was going to take that seriously. She needed something undeniable, and every route she tried ran into the same wall. And the final hearing, she'd learned from the news, was only days away. If you've ever had a piece of the truth that nobody would take seriously yet, comment, "I'd have kept digging too," below, because that's exactly where Rachel is right now, and she's running out of time. Days unfolded across 3 more sleepless nights, the kind that left Rachel running the shop on autopilot the next morning, smiling at customers with a face that felt borrowed. Her real mind 2 steps removed, still tangled in spreadsheets and shell company filings. She widened her search past Han Woo-jin's name alone, into every entity his consulting firm had ever touched, no matter how minor. Most of it was noise, legitimate contracts, ordinary business, the kind of paperwork any real company generates by the thousands. But buried in the noise, she found a second layer, a smaller firm, nested inside the first, whose only activity in 18 months had been receiving 4 wire transfers, each one timed within days of a private Kang Enterprises board meeting. Rachel didn't have access to what was discussed in those board meetings. She didn't need to. The timing alone was a kind of confession. Someone had known, each time, when something worth acting on had just happened behind closed doors. She printed everything and taped it to her kitchen wall in a widening constellation of dates and names and arrows, the way she used to build a case before trial, and stood back from it at 2 in the morning, with her arms crossed, looking at the full shape of what she now believed had happened. It broke her heart a little, honestly, even though she'd never met any of these people. She thought about Min Jae, a man she only knew from headlines and one brief, ordinary encounter over a coffee order, and thought about what it must feel like to learn, at the worst possible moment of your life, that the 2 people closest to you had spent months quietly building the machine that would crush you. She thought about the particular loneliness of that kind of betrayal, the kind that doesn't just take your freedom, it takes your ability to trust your own judgment about people ever again. She thought, too, about herself, about the version of Rachel who might have had someone dig this hard for her 3 years ago, and hadn't. Nobody had come for her. She could still come for him. But knowing something and proving it were 2 entirely different countries, and Rachel had spent 8 years of her career learning exactly how wide that gap could be. Motive, opportunity, a pattern of meetings, a trail of oddly timed transfers. All of it circled the truth without landing squarely on top of it. Any competent defense attorney, and Ji Hayes would certainly be competent, could explain away every piece individually. A businessman having a consulting firm wasn't a crime. A fiancé having coffee with a colleague wasn't a crime. Timing, on its own, was never enough. She needed the piece that turned circumstantial into undeniable. And she had no idea, 3 days out from the final hearing, where that piece was hiding. 2 nights before the final hearing, Rachel was sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by paper, staring at the same wall of dates and arrows she'd been staring at for a week, feeling for the first time since this started like she might actually fail. Every thread she pulled led somewhere, but nothing led all the way. She had motive, she had a pattern, she had 2 names she was now almost certain belonged to the people who'd destroyed Kang Min-jae's life. What she didn't have was the one clean, undeniable connection that would survive a hostile cross-examination, the thing that turned "this looks suspicious" into "this is proof." She rubbed her eyes until they ached and closed her laptop, defeated in a way she hadn't let herself feel yet, because feeling it meant admitting she might walk into that courtroom with nothing but a story nobody would believe. Maya wandered in around 9, supposed to be asleep, wrapped in her blanket like a small, stubborn ghost, and climbed into the chair beside her mother without being invited. She'd taken to doing this over the past week, sensing, without being told, exactly how much weight her mother was carrying, and simply choosing to sit inside it with her rather than ask questions Rachel didn't have energy to answer. "You're doing the Bill face," Maya said quietly. "I know." "Is it because of the coffee man?" "It's because of the coffee man." Rachel managed something close to a smile. "I have almost everything, baby. I just can't find the last piece. There's a gap between one thing and another thing, and I can't prove they're connected. And without that, none of this is going to be enough." Maya was quiet for a long moment, tracing a finger along the edge of the taped-up papers on the wall. The same serious concentration she brought to a hard math problem. "What kind of gap?" "A date, maybe. A name. Something small that ties it all together. I've read through everything I have 100 times." And then Maya's face changed. That particular shift Rachel had come to recognize over 8 years, the one that meant a stray piece of her daughter's flypaper memory, had just clicked into place. "The company name," Maya said slowly. Rachel looked up. "What?" "The lady said a company name once." "I remember because it sounded like a person's name, not a company name. It sounded like Han." Maya frowned harder, reaching back through weeks of memory. "And a date. She said a date, and I remember because it was my birthday. Not this year. Before. She said it like it already happened, but it wasn't my birthday yet when she said it, so I thought that was funny. Like she was talking about the future, like it already happened." Rachel felt her entire body go still. "Maya, what was the date?" "March 14, Maya said instantly, without hesitation, because that date belonged to her, the way very few things in the world did. "My birthday." Rachel's hands moved to her laptop so fast she nearly knocked over her coffee. She typed the date into her search bar with trembling fingers, cross-referencing it against every filing she'd gathered about the Shell consulting firm. There it was. March 14th, the exact date, buried in a public procurement filing Rachel had skimmed past twice before, without registering its significance, was the day the Shell consulting firm had been quietly awarded a subcontract on the Solomon's Gate project. Not through Han Woo-jin's name directly, through a numbered entity, but the payment routing, when Rachel finally cross-referenced it against the banking disclosure required for government infrastructure work, traced back through 2 more shell layers directly to an account Han Woo-jin controlled personally. It was the missing link, the thread that connected a private consulting firm to the very project whose classified technology had leaked. It explained access. It explained motive. It explained, finally, how. And it meant something else, too. Something that made Rachel's chest tighten with a different kind of dread. If Ji-hye had known about that award weeks before it became public, she hadn't just been overhearing gossip about a business deal. She'd had advanced knowledge of something confidential, something only someone deeply embedded in the process could have known that early. Rachel sat back in her chair, her hands shaking, staring at the wall of paper she'd built over 3 exhausting weeks, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. The specific, electric certainty of a case finally, completely coming together. "Maya," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "You just found the piece I couldn't find in a week of digging." Maya beamed, delighted and slightly confused about what exactly she'd done right. "Does that mean the coffee man is going to be in trouble?" "It means," Rachel said, pulling her daughter into a fierce, sudden hug, "that tomorrow we're going to go make sure an innocent man doesn't spend the rest of his life paying for something he didn't do." "Like a real lawyer?" Rachel laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself have in longer than she wanted to admit. Like a real lawyer, she spent the rest of that night organizing everything into a binder, the way she used to for trial, hands moving with the confident precision of muscle memory she thought she'd lost forever, a version of herself she hadn't seen in the mirror in 3 years, finally, quietly, coming back online. Tomorrow was the final hearing. There would be no time for a second chance. Kang Min-jae had not slept the night before his final hearing either, not because he was afraid of prison, though he was, in a distant, disbelieving way, but because he had spent the night doing something worse, trying to figure out who among the handful of people he trusted could possibly have done this to him. He had gone through the list 100 times. His executive team, his board, old business rivals with old grudges. None of it fit. The evidence against him was too precise, too intimate, built from knowledge only someone extremely close to him could have possessed. He refused, every single time his mind circled toward it, to let himself consider Woo Jin. 30 years of friendship did not simply evaporate because the evidence was inconvenient. 30 years meant something. It had to. He thought again, in the long silence before dawn, of the little girl who'd told him his tie looked like it was having a bad day, and wished, in a vague and helpless way, that someone like that existed in his corner now. Someone who believed things simply, cleanly, without needing to be convinced. He had no idea she was hours away from walking into his courtroom and changing everything. The morning of the hearing, Rachel, dressed in the one blazer she'd kept from her old life, packed away in the back of her closet for 3 years, the fabric slightly stiff from disuse. Her hands shook as she buttoned it. "You look like a real lawyer," Maya said solemnly, watching from the bed. "I am a real lawyer," Rachel said, mostly to convince herself. "I never stopped being one. I just stopped practicing. Are you scared? Rachel considered lying, then decided her daughter deserved better than that. A little. It's been a long time since I stood up in front of a judge, and the last time didn't go very well for me. Maya slid off the bed and wrapped her small arms around her mother's waist, fierce and sudden, the way she did everything. You believed him when nobody else did. That's the important part, right? That's what you always tell me. Rachel knelt down and looked her daughter directly in the eyes. It is the most important part. Thank you for reminding me. Can I come? Rachel hesitated. Every instinct told her to leave Maya with a neighbor, to keep her 8-year-old as far from a courtroom as possible. But Maya was the reason any of this had come together at all. It felt wrong, somehow, to shut her out of the ending of a story she'd started. Stay close to me, Rachel said finally. And Maya, whatever happens in there, I need you to let me do the talking. Can you do that? Maya's face went uncharacteristically serious. I can be quiet when it matters. Rachel would remember that promise later, with no small amount of affectionate exasperation, given exactly how that morning actually unfolded. They arrived at the courthouse with 20 minutes to spare. Rachel's binder clutched against her chest, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She'd requested, through channels she hadn't used in 3 years, calling in a favor from a Korean licensed attorney she'd met at a legal aid clinic months earlier who agreed, out of professional curiosity more than anything, to formally co-sign the motion that would let Rachel present evidence at all, the chance to submit new evidence before the final ruling came down. It was a long shot. Courts didn't reopen evidence on the morning of a verdict for just anyone. But Rachel had learned, a long time ago, that sometimes you didn't wait for permission. You showed up with the truth in your hands and made the room deal with it. She told Maya to wait in the gallery, in the second row, beside the co-signing attorney, while Rachel went to find the clerk's office to formally file the motion. Inside the courtroom, the mood was already heavy with inevitability. Reporters filled the back rows, sketching artists poised with their pads, everyone there to witness what most of them assumed was a formality, the final confirmation of a verdict the whole country had already decided on weeks ago. Min Jae was led in wearing a gray suit that hung slightly loose on him now. 3 weeks of barely eating having taken a visible toll. His shoulders bowed under a weight no one in that room fully understood, except, somehow, an 8-year-old girl in the second row who was watching him with her hands balled into small fists in her lap. Seo Ji-hye sat 2 rows behind the defense table, composed, elegant, dressed in soft mourning colors that suggested a woman grieving what her fiancé had allegedly become, rather than a woman who had built the entire disaster with her own hands. Han Woo-jin stood near the back wall, arms crossed, jaw tight, looking like a man attending a funeral he had personally arranged. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge began reading the formal charges into the record in the flat, procedural voice of a man who had done this 1,000 times and expected today to be no different. In the matter of the state versus Kang Min-jae, on the charge of unauthorized disclosure of classified national infrastructure technology, the court finds that the evidence presented, Maya's hands, balled in her lap, unclenched, She was on her feet before the co-signing attorney beside her could even register she'd moved, sliding out of the gallery bench and into the center aisle with the fearless, unthinking speed only a child who has never learned to doubt herself can move with.
He didn't do it!
The room detonated into stunned silence in the exact way it had the very first time this moment was described. Except now, finally, it was happening in full, unhurried, agonizing real time, every second of it earned. The judge's gavel froze midair. The court reporter's hands stopped over her keys. A reporter in the back row half rose out of her seat, phone already lifting to record. Min-jae's head came up slowly, disbelieving, and found the small girl standing in the aisle with her arms spread wide, as if she alone could stand between him and the entire machinery of the court. "Whose child is this?" the judge said, more startled than angry, setting the gavel down without striking it. "Bailiff, I know who framed him," Maya said, and her voice, though it trembled at the very edges, did not break. The judge leaned forward, caught somewhere between procedure and disbelief. "Young lady, this is a court of law. You cannot simply—" "He's innocent," Maya said again, louder, chin lifting higher, and something about the sheer, uncomplicated certainty in her voice seemed to steal the air out of the room entirely. "I know who framed him." Nobody had an answer for that. Not the judge, who sat back slightly, genuinely unsettled for the first time in the proceeding. Not the prosecutor, half risen from his chair, with an objection dying on his lips because he couldn't quite decide what he'd even be objecting to. Not Seo Ji-hye, whose serene composure had gone very still, her folded hands tightening almost imperceptibly in her lap. Not Han Woo-jin, near the back wall, who had gone the color of old paper and hadn't moved a single muscle. Min-jae stared at the little girl in the aisle, the same little girl who'd told him his tie was having a bad day, and felt something in his chest crack open that he hadn't let himself feel in 3 weeks. Hope. Dangerous, reckless hope. The judge opened his mouth to order her removed, and that was the exact moment the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom began to open. Every head in the room turned. Backlit by the corridor lights, a woman stepped through, a folder clutched to her chest like something precious, her spine straightening as she crossed the threshold, her eyes finding Maya first, relief and terror colliding on her face in the space of a single breath, and then moving past her daughter to the bench. "Your Honor," Rachel's voice, when it came, carried the length of the courtroom, steady in a way that surprised even her. "My name is Rachel Johnson. I was formerly licensed to practice law in the state of Georgia, and I am currently co-counsel of record, filed this morning, with attorney Han Ji-woo." She gestured to the man rising from the second row, folder in hand, nodding to the judge in confirmation. "I respectfully request permission to present newly discovered evidence relevant to this case before final judgment is entered." The prosecutor was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This woman has no standing. She is filed as co-counsel," the judge said, glancing at the paperwork the co-signing attorney had just handed forward, his expression unreadable. He looked, for a long moment, at Rachel, and then at the small, fierce girl still standing in the aisle, refusing to move, and something in his face shifted. Not quite sympathy, but curiosity, a willingness at least to hear it. Not quite sympathy. This court does not typically reopen evidentiary review the morning of a verdict, But given the severity of the sentence being considered, and given that the motion is properly filed, I will allow 10 minutes. Counsel, you may proceed. And someone please escort the child back to the gallery. Actually, Your Honor, Rachel said, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt the old, familiar fire return to her spine. I'd ask that my daughter be permitted to remain nearby. She is, as it happens, an essential witness to how this evidence was discovered. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge studied Rachel for a long moment, then nodded once. Proceed, counsel. Rachel crossed to the front of the courtroom, set her binder on the podium, and opened it with hands that had finally stopped shaking. 3 weeks ago, she began, my daughter, who works alongside me at our family coffee shop, overheard a series of conversations between 2 individuals who met at our establishment every Tuesday and Friday for a period of approximately 2 months. At the time, these conversations meant nothing to her. She was a child doing her homework nearby. It was only after Mr. Kang's arrest that she recognized fragments of what she'd overheard as directly relevant to this case. Your Honor, this is hearsay from a minor, the prosecutor cut in. Overheard conversation with no corroborating. I have corroborating evidence for every claim I'm about to present, Rachel said calmly, not missing a beat, and slid the first exhibit toward the bench. This is time-stamped security footage from our shop, cross-referenced with point-of-sale records, showing 2 individuals meeting at a corner table on 40 separate occasions over 8 weeks, always Tuesdays and Fridays, always the same table. She let that land before continuing. On its own, this proves only that 2 people drank coffee together frequently. I want to be direct about that. It is not, by itself, evidence of a crime. Seo Ji-hae's lawyer rose smoothly. Then, Your Honor, I fail to see the relevance of... I would ask counsel to let me finish, Rachel said, with a politeness that had teeth in it, and turned back to the judge. The footage does not show either individual's face clearly, but it does show, consistently, a woman with a distinctive coat and hairstyle and a man in a gray coat. My daughter noticed a physical detail, a mole on the woman's jawline, that allowed us to identify her from a public photograph. Rachel slid the second exhibit forward, the magazine photograph beside a still frame from the security footage, the small mark circled on both images. The woman in this photograph is Seo Ji-hae. The courtroom erupted into low, urgent whispers. Ji-hae's composure finally cracked, just barely, a tightening around her eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there before. Coincidence, her lawyer said quickly. A mole is not a fingerprint, Your Honor. This is circumstantial at best. I agree, Rachel said, evenly, which is why I did not stop there. She produced the third exhibit, the corporate biography photograph of Han Woo-jin, matched against his build and the gray coat visible in the footage, and laid out, methodically, the shell consulting firm, the layered ownership structure, the way it had been registered 18 months earlier, with deliberately obscured ownership. On its own, this proves only that Mr. Han has a consulting firm. Businessmen have consulting firms. This too would be circumstantial, until you examine what that firm actually did. She placed the fourth exhibit on the bench, the procurement filing. This subcontract, awarded to a shipping logistics firm client of Mr. Han's consulting company, connects directly, through banking disclosures required under Korea's infrastructure transparency law, to the Solomon's Gate National Project, the very project whose classified technology is alleged to have been leaked by Mr. Kang's company. The prosecutor was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is an enormous leap. A subcontractor having connections to a project doesn't prove anyone leaked anything. You're right, Rachel said, and the calm agreement seemed to catch the prosecutor off guard. It doesn't, on its own. I want to be completely transparent with this court. This evidence, individually, would not have been sufficient to overturn a conviction on its own. Each piece, alone, can be explained away. A coincidental mole, a businessman's private firm, a subcontractor with distant ties to a national project. Any one of these, a skilled defense could dismiss. She paused, and for the first time looked down at her daughter, who had been allowed, at the judge's nod, to stand near the counsel table rather than be sent back to the gallery. But there was one detail my daughter remembered that connects everything else into something no longer explainable as coincidence. The room went utterly still. Maya, Rachel said gently, can you tell the court what you told me about the date? Maya looked up at the sea of unfamiliar adult faces, at the judge, at the man behind the defense table, whose eyes had not left her since she first stood up in the aisle, and for one small moment, she looked like exactly what she was, an 8-year-old girl in a very big room. Then her chin lifted, the same way it had the moment she'd first stepped into the aisle, and she spoke clearly. The lady with the mole said a date once. I remembered it because it was my birthday, March 14. But she said it before my birthday had even happened yet, like she was talking about something that already happened. That felt weird to me, so I remembered it. Rachel took over, sliding the final exhibit forward. March 14th is the exact date, according to public procurement records, that the Shell consulting firm's client was quietly awarded the subcontract on Solomon's Gate, nearly 2 months before that award became public knowledge. The only way Miss Seo could have referenced that date with certainty, weeks before it was publicly announced, is if she already knew it was going to happen, which means she had advance knowledge of a confidential government procurement decision that had not yet been made public, knowledge that only someone with insider access to the process could possess. Rachel let the silence stretch, deliberately, before delivering the final piece. Your Honor, my daughter is 8 years old. She has no legal training, no motive to fabricate testimony, and no possible way to have invented a date that precisely matches a confidential filing she has never seen and could not have accessed. The only explanation for how she knew that date, weeks before it became public, is that she heard it, exactly as she has said, from the 2 people now sitting in this courtroom, discussing a crime they had already set in motion against a man who trusted them both completely. The prosecutor opened his mouth and then, for the first time in the entire hearing, closed it again without saying anything. Seo Ji-hae's lawyer rose one more time, his voice noticeably less certain. Your Honor, this is a chain of inference, not direct. Counsel, the judge said, and his voice carried a weight it hadn't held before. I have presided over a great many cases, built entirely on evidence, that was, in fact, less coherent than what I have just heard from an 8-year-old and her mother. I am ordering a formal investigation, effective immediately, into both Seo Ji-hae and Han Woo-jin, including full forensic audit of the consulting firm's finances and communications. Bailiff, Please ensure neither individual leaves this building. Han Woo-jin's face had gone completely gray. He did not attempt to run, did not attempt to argue. He simply sat down, slowly, as though something inside him had finally given out under a weight he'd been carrying for months. Seo Ji-hye, to the very end, tried one last time. Min-jae, you can't believe any of this. This is absurd. A child's overheard. Min-jae, who had not said a single word throughout the entire hearing, finally looked at her, not with rage, with something quieter and far more devastating, the look of a man finally, fully understanding the shape of what he'd lost. You never once, he said, very quietly, asked me how I was doing. Not during any of it. Not once. She had no answer for that. The formal investigation took only 4 days to confirm what Rachel's evidence had already made unmistakable. Forensic accountants traced the full scope of the shell firm's finances and found not just the subcontract, but a paper trail of digital access logs Han Woo-jin, as chief operating officer, had legitimate reason to touch, but had used, months earlier, to quietly copy classified project files onto external storage, planting fabricated digital footprints that pointed back to Min-jae's own credentials. Under formal questioning, faced with evidence too complete to argue against, Woo-jin finally broke. He confessed everything, not with defiance, but with something closer to grief. He said he'd told himself, at first, it was only business, that Min-jae had more than enough, that he deserved a piece of what he'd helped build. He said, Ji-hye had found him at exactly the moment he was most susceptible to that lie, when years of standing in his best friend's shadow had curdled into something he was ashamed to name even now. He said he hated himself more than any judge in that courtroom ever could. It didn't matter, in the end. The confession, combined with Rachel's evidence, was more than enough. Kang Min-jae was declared formally, completely innocent, every charge dismissed, his name and his company's reputation restored in a public statement the judge himself insisted on making, given how badly the initial rush to judgment had failed him. Seo Ji-hye and Han Woo-jin were both arrested that same afternoon. Kang Min-jae walked out of the courthouse a free man for the first time in 3 weeks, into daylight that felt, he would later say, entirely unfamiliar on his skin. He found them 3 days later, not because it was hard. Rachel's cup wasn't exactly difficult to locate, but because it took him that long to work up the nerve to walk through the door of the shop that had, without either of them realizing it, saved his life. The bell above the door rang. Maya looked up from behind the counter first, and her whole face lit up like she'd been expecting him. "You came," she said, delighted. "I told Mommy you'd come. She said you were probably too busy being rich." I said rich people still need coffee. "Maya," Rachel said from the espresso machine, mortified, "let the man breathe." Min-jae, for the first time in longer than he could remember, laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. "She's not wrong. I do still need coffee." He sat at the counter, not the corner table. He never sat at that table again, not once, for the rest of his life. And for a long moment, none of them quite knew what to say to each other. 3 strangers, bound together now by something none of them had asked for. "I don't know how to thank you," he said finally, looking at Rachel. "There isn't a version of that sentence that feels big enough." I know what it feels like, Rachel said quietly, wiping down the counter, not quite meeting his eyes, to have the truth against you and nobody willing to listen. I wasn't going to let that happen to someone else if I could stop it. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, sliding it across the counter. Rachel didn't even look at it. No, Rachel, we didn't do it for money, she said, firm but not unkind. Please put that away. Maya slapped her small hand flat on the counter. I know how you can repay us. You have to come here every morning. For coffee. That's the payment. And if you miss even one day, I'm writing your name in my bad customer notebook. Min Jae stared at her, and then something in his chest loosened completely, for the first time in years. Deal, he said, and shook her hand with ceremonial gravity. He kept his word, and it was in the keeping of that small, ordinary promise, morning after morning, that everything else quietly began. At first it was just coffee. Then it was coffee and 10 extra minutes, because Rachel had started remembering how he took it before he even sat down. Then it was Min Jae staying through the slow part of the morning, helping Maya with a school project about the solar system, because, he claimed, someone needs to correct her theory that Pluto is just being dramatic. Then it was a Tuesday evening he stayed late to help Rachel balance the shop's books, both of them elbow to elbow over a laptop, close enough that neither of them noticed how close they'd gotten until Maya walked in and cleared her throat loudly enough to make them both jump apart. It grew the way real things grow, not in leaps, but in the accumulation of 100 unremarkable Tuesdays. The morning Rachel quietly started saving him the last of the good pastries before the rush cleared them out, without ever mentioning she was doing it. The evening he learned, in careful pieces over many weeks, about Marcus Webb and Atlanta and everything Rachel had lost, and listened without interrupting, the way she had never quite gotten to be listened to by anyone back home. The morning he told her, simply, that she should go back to law, that she shouldn't be pouring coffee for a living when she'd just taken apart a conspiracy with a security camera and a receipt. It was Maya, inevitably, who forced the issue into daylight. "Do you like my mummy?" she asked one Saturday morning, entirely out of nowhere, watching her mother and Min Jae with the calculating patience of a detective who had already solved the case. Min Jae choked on his coffee. Rachel turned the precise shade of red that matches a stop sign. "I do," Min Jae said finally, quietly, looking directly at Rachel. "I've liked her for a while now. I think I've liked her since the first week she started saving me the last pastry and pretending she wasn't doing it on purpose." "Great," Maya said, thoroughly satisfied, picking her orange juice back up. "So it's settled. I finally have a daddy." It took several more months, unhurried, before Min Jae said the actual words out loud. On an evening walk after the shop had closed, the city lights spread out below them, from a bench he'd chosen with obvious care. "I love you," he said, without any of the polish that came so naturally to him in every other part of his life. "I think all I actually want is to be someone Maya writes good things about in her notebook, and someone you trust enough to keep letting into your mornings." "I love you too," Rachel said, crying for only the third time in 3 years, though this time it didn't hurt at all. They married the following spring. Maya walked down the aisle first, scattering flower petals, and halfway down she stopped, turned to the crowd and announced, "This is the best case I ever solved," which got a laugh loud enough the officiant had to wait a full minute to continue. Rachel's law firm, Johnson & Johnson, a name Maya insisted on because it sounds like a superhero team, opened 4 months later, and over the next 2 years, overturned 4 wrongful convictions for people no one else would represent. Min Jae's company emerged from the scandal stronger than ever, its reputation restored by the very public, very complete truth of what had actually happened. 2 years later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Maya's baby brother toddled directly into a display of potted flowers by the window, sending the whole arrangement crashing to the floor. Before Rachel could even turn around, Maya had already scooped him up, brushing the soil off his overalls, and turned to face the small gathered audience of customers with her chin lifted and her arms wrapped protectively around him, the exact same way they had once spread wide in a courtroom to shield a man she'd never even properly met. He didn't do it. The shop erupted into laughter. Rachel bent over the counter, Min Jae wiping his eyes, customers laughing along without fully understanding why, sensing only that they'd witnessed something that clearly meant everything to the family in front of them. "It's a very serious legal defense," Maya protested, fighting her own grin. "It's the best one I've ever heard," Min Jae said. Rachel came around the counter and pulled both her children into a hug, right there among the scattered soil, and looked over their heads at her husband, a man she'd once seen only as a name on a television screen, a stranger nobody in the world had been willing to believe. She had believed him. Her daughter had believed him first, and loudest, and most fearlessly, and Rachel had simply had the good sense to listen. "Truth always finds a voice," Maya said, to no one in particular, to the whole shop, to the life the 3 of them, now 4, had built out of one overheard conversation and one very stubborn 8-year-old's refusal to stay quiet. And if this story made you feel even a fraction of what that little girl felt standing in that courtroom, if you laughed with Maya, ached for Min Jae, or found yourself rooting for Rachel to walk through those doors, let us know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and we'll see you in the next story.